All right.
Uh,
Just Joe, do you have any idea if should I send an email over to Bob? I see that Bob hasn't joined.
Yeah, why
Uh,
don't you? I guess I can do it really quick, Sean.
all right.
Um,
Because I know that James is going to have the Kita start with the Kita presentation, and then we have Bob with the TIFF presentation. So I wanted to make sure that he was here and he was sent the invite and he did confirm that. So
sure, I'll CC you. Why doesn't James start, and then we can do the other
go
thing.
from there.
of
Perfect.
course.
Okay, it is 9:32. We will call this meeting of the Port Orchard Economic and Tourism Development Committee to order. Um, I think we'll just jump right into our agenda items, and the first up is James from PETA.
All right. Well, give me a sec. I'll pull up the slideshow. Right. All right. Everybody can see this?
Yep.
Sweet.
Yep.
So our Q2 has been a busy one, everybody. Kitsap Economic Development Alliance has been involved in a few different things. We've had up to that point, up through Q2, we've had a fairly active year. So 227 business retention and expansion contacts. There was a lot of activity going on in BRE. But I know what you're looking for is this last quarter here. One thing that should be noted, Apex Accelerator is a huge driver of our direct technical assistance for Kitsap. The classes that we've offered in this quarter two, we've offered 7 classes. We've got 25 new clients come on. We've had a total of 172 counseling hours just in Q2, and 48 of those 48 clients counseled. So that is a very large and active piece of our business retention and expansion activity. Few different classes that the business that Apex Accelerator offers, and these were all quarter two, is solicitation, go, no go, and federal contracting lexicon. You'll notice kind of a theme here. Terry Holmberg, who's our lead trainer, has designed a spectrum of classes to offer to government contractors, starting from the beginning, pre-award, pre-submission to post-award. And so we're currently running through that lineup right now. But again, these are the 7 classes that we offered in quarter two. In addition to that, we have a couple of different efforts. One of them includes Prime Connect, which some of you are familiar with. That helps, we invite prime contractors, so government prime contractors, on every month to discuss what they've got going on, and so that we can introduce them to our subcontractors in the region. And that, again, is an effort to strengthen our local economy and our local contracting base ahead of SIOP and going forward, frankly, because we really need, the more people we can get local here than are involved with the contracting, construction, and development of Kitsap, the better. And we're trying to set them up the best way we can. Contracting coffee hours, another initiative where we're running through different questions that contractors will have, in addition to connecting people with resources locally. We did a few different events this last quarter. BIPOC Business Forum, the Grow Your Business with Government Contracting, was very well attended, and we have received a lot of good feedback on that. But it allowed prospective businesses getting into government contracting an opportunity to see different pathways, and also to explore some of the requirements that were required there, and also help to set their business up on a little bit more firm ground. In addition to that, we ran a Meet the Agencies regional event, which was focused on connecting local businesses with our municipal districts. We did several site visits this last quarter, including Kettlefish, Yoke, Sterling Custom Homes, I went out to the Washington State Ferries. We've been out at Radiant. Joe did some work with Briny Bagels, and we continue some work with Farbank and Olala Winery. We've been heavy into recruitment this last quarter. We met and received a Tasmanian delegation around the marine industry cluster. So that was exciting. We did a number of targeted outreach, of which this quarter we're working on some of the follow-up on that. Our Washington Autonomous Vehicle cluster also did some contact and outreach to recruit for the innovation cluster out here, and we were in the running for Project Blue Current for a little bit, but then they had decided to go to an I-5 corridor location. So we ran a couple of different things as well. We've been, if you guys weren't aware, we were running a micro business accelerator, or at least in partnership with the Vibe. We were working with them to offer different classes that supported our local small and micro businesses. One of those was Unlock Your Potential with Government with Credit, and we had Jenna Finesse out. We also had a familiar lineup of people talking about important things in bookkeeping. We just graduated that cohort, so there were 14 graduates of that cohort, micro businesses that went through the business enterprise startup training and also a number of other different lightning talk trainings. So that was a very well received and successful event. We ran a Lean 101 class in partnership with Impact Washington. In addition to that, we continue work on our ecosystem mapping and our on-conference efforts, again, in partnership with the Vibe Coworks. We have been running solicitations, so we've been basically acting as kind of an information portal for the SIAP project. If you go to kitsapeda.org, you'll find a page dedicated towards shipyard infrastructure optimization plan solicitations and other news around that. And we've been working a little bit with the rural county businesses as well. In addition to that, we started the Kitsap Industrial Land and Building survey. And so that is underway at this moment. So just a couple of highlights. Again, the Meet the Agencies from Apex was very well attended. We had over 120 attendees. The Micro Business Accelerator end of year celebration that was very well received. We love working with Vibe Coworks and our micro businesses in the area. And the BIPOC Business Forum, again, people found a lot of value in that. That was the constant feedback that we had heard. So. Yeah, I think that's the end of it. So I'm happy to answer any questions or get into any comments.
I'll start with questions on his presentation. No? James, you want to fill us in on you got a couple of things coming up too. I think I saw one of the ones later this month that might be full or close to being full.
Yeah, the Kitsap Industrial Readiness Summit. That is one that I would encourage anybody that's interested in what's happening with and around the SIAP project and other industrial efforts to attend. That's on August 22nd. And so it may be coming up to full because I know that one. So yes, if you're interested, please do sign up soon or reach out to me or Joe.
Any other questions for James or Kida?
Well, I was just going to say that was very informative, and I learned a lot from that presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, certainly.
Perfect. Hearing no other questions for James. Thank you, James. We appreciate it as always. Also, next up we have TIF I'm going to get this wrong. Improvement financing. T stands for
Tax increment
Tax
finance.
Tax
tax. Thank you.
Yeah.
I kept wanting to say transportation, but tax increment financing. So this was a particular topic I had learned about at the AWC conference, whenever that was, already, I think back in May. And you know, the city of, I can't remember if it was Richfield or Ridgefield, one of the two, had a really great case study on where they had utilized this, both the pros and the cons. And so I know Joe Morrison had wanted to talk about this as well. But basically, kind of a cool new way that we could help fund future growth. And I know we had a presenter coming, but I don't see his name, Bob, on there.
No, it appears that Bob has not joined this meeting, and we did send an email reminder before this meeting, and he has not joined. So unfortunately, the presenter is not here at the moment.
Okay. We can bump this, or Joe, if you're prepared to have, I'm not either because the presentation wasn't in here. So
No, the idea of me presenting on TIF is unfortunately a bad one.
yeah,
I'll preface this a little bit, and then we can chase this down with Bob for another meeting. And
Yep.
you know, I haven't heard from him, so you have my apologies, but perhaps something happened and these things occur. Tax increment financing, loosely, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, just go ahead and correct me. Loosely, the concept is that the future value of an improvement in a perfect world is used to pay for those improvements in the present time, okay? And there's a mechanism to make sure that happens. In Washington State, it's more complicated than it is in other states. Most states have some form of tax increment financing on the books. Washington State, just due to our nature, has a more limited set of development finance tools that we can use to revitalize areas, right? So we wanted to take a look at this. We think there's plenty of opportunity to find things to revitalize, both in the city of Port Orchard, the city of Bremerton, and throughout Kitsap County. So we want to understand what these tools are. More equally as importantly, these tools have been utilized now. So, you know, when they first rolled out a couple years ago, the question was, who's going to utilize them and how's it going to happen? We now have a couple case studies that we can evaluate. Unfortunately, I'm not a subject matter expert, and our subject matter expert isn't here. So I will work with Sean to reschedule him. You have my apologies, and we'll do what we can. So
yeah. There was a lot of good takeaways because of does anybody remember if Richfield or Richland? It doesn't really matter. But essentially they had a project. Mayor, you know who it is?
It's Richfield, and it had to do with their Costco. So the development, I'm not certain that we're ripe for it. I don't know that we have enough development opportunity in our downtown or on Bethel.
On Bethel, what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, to make that lift. So, but you know, it's good doesn't hurt to get information, but it is Richfield, and it had, I believe, the development in particular was a Costco store. And if we, you know, we don't really even have you know, at least not on land that is in our control or in our jurisdiction, big enough for a Costco, probably.
So
size development.
The Home Depot that we're working on is the one that comes to mind for me, and they have a couple of other pads as part of that development. And so I think the possibility exists that you could look at that expected development and bond improvements to the Bethel corridor on the back of that lift. But I've been looking at the MRSC website, has a pretty good overview of how this works. And there's lots of examples from other cities, but you basically have to do a study that looks at kind of a high, medium, and low risk scenario so that council is going into any decision to borrow money eyes wide open in terms of the debt that they would be taking on and the risk of not being able to repay it on the back of expected development. And so ultimately, I think the reason we are wanting to have this now is we're heading into budget season. And so if the council wanted to pursue this, you're going to need to put money into actually evaluating the prospects for doing it. And I think that, you know, I think the mayor's probably right. I don't know that we're ripe for this right now. But it's a worthwhile discussion.
For sure. I think had this been available when we were starting to flush out some of the Bethel stuff, I think it would have been a great avenue to drive down. The long and short of it is you've got to set up and I don't know if it's a district or a set footprint for this area, and essentially you're going to build the infrastructure for the future development. And so there's also got to be a threshold. I want to say, was it 200 million in growth that is to be expected within that footprint as well. And then there were some bonuses to added tax growth and where those funds go for a time period. And that's where we had learned some of the do's and don'ts from another city with other, say, junior taxing districts. So.
Well, the good news is that I think we've been joined by our subject matter expert who can tell us all these things.
And fill in those gaps that we left. So, Bob, I'll let you unmute and introduce yourself and talk us a little through the TIF.
Sure. Sorry, I'm late, and it's great to be here. Bob Stowe Development Strategies, economic development, sort of real estate consultant, primarily for cities, counties, some tribal affairs, and then some higher education. Been doing this for almost 9 years, and then a prior 30-year career as a city manager at several different cities in Washington State. And so I think worked on, since the new TIF legislation was created, maybe a dozen TIF projects across the state. I think we've completed 7 project analysis that have gone forward and formed a tax increment area. Others are still in the process, but I'm glad to be here today to share some information with all of you. So I'm not sure if you want me to sort of run through sort of a TIF 101 introduction presentation or just address questions that you might have. What would be the best way to spend our time?
Let's start with a 101.
Okay. Let me share my screen if I have that ability. I think the host has to disable that or allow me to do so.
Jim, if you can make Mr. Stowe a host, if you have that ability.
It should be good to go.
Bob, are you able to share or?
Yeah, hold on a moment, please. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. You should be able to see my screen now.
Right. Yeah.
So this is probably a model that you've seen in over the years, but it's a basic tax increment financing model that exists not only in Washington State, but really in all the states that offer TIF, and which is the majority of them, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2. But generally, it's TIF it's based on the new assessed value that gets generated from infrastructure that is financed through the taxes that are generated from that development. And so when you set a tax increment area, there's a base that's formed. And so if you were to set a tax increment area for June 1 of 2025, there would be an existing tax base in which jurisdictions would continue to apply their tax levies to, and then taxes would be allocated as they would be against that existing base. And it's the new incremental taxes that get generated from the infrastructure that's created that goes to the TIF sponsor. And so you may have 4 or 5 different taxing districts that levies are being applied to that new AV growth that's supplying the investment or the dollars necessary to fund the infrastructure in the first place. The difference in Washington State's tax increment financing in many states is that it excludes significant portions of taxing revenue, and primarily from the state property tax system is excluded from the TIF, as well as school levies. And so sort of a basic overview of tax increment financing is that it's available to cities, counties, and ports. So there's only 3 jurisdictions that can form a tax increment area. Although it's limited in the tax levies that it utilizes, it's still a very powerful economic development tool. And because most of the time, jurisdictions who are forming tax increment areas are pledging their full faith and credit through the issuance of limited term general obligation bonds, it's really designed for a project-specific area, and not necessarily one that you would form a tax increment area and hope development will happen. You'll want to have development close behind when you form a tax increment area, because if you're issuing LTGO bonds, you're responsible for those bonds regardless of whether or not any development occurs during the TIF term of maximum of 25 years. All the projects and sort of all TIF analysis or projects have a but-for element. But for the public investment, the project would not occur, the development would not occur. And so we'll want to establish really that good policy as to why TIF resources should be utilized for private development. And of course, all of that results in new AV that generates new public benefits, and then construction of the development, which also produces both short and long-term jobs. And it's those taxes from that new construction, that new development, that fund that needed public infrastructure. Sort of some key limitations include that our process is that you have to adopt an ordinance if you're a city or a county, a resolution if you're a port, that designates the increment area, that identifies the public improvements, and then whether or not bonds would be issued. And some limitations include that you can't, any of those jurisdictions, city, county, or port, you can have no more than 2 active increment areas at any one time, and they may not overlap. Those increment areas in combination, either 1 or 2 of them, cannot be more than 200 million of assessed valuation at the time that the tax increment area is formed, or more than 20% of the AV of the sponsoring jurisdiction. We haven't seen, really the governing point there is the 200 million, because most jurisdictions are well beyond the 20%. Or the AV is, their total AV is much higher, and so you never really do approach the 20% of the AV rather. Once you form the tax increment area, you can't add additional improvements, or you can't change the boundary of the increment area once adopted. You do have the option, and many cities of jurisdictions have done this, is very generally describing the improvements so that you have some flexibility. Some jurisdictions simply describe them as streets, roads, water and sewer type improvements, and therefore you have a lot of flexibility as to what, when it comes to issuing the debt, and through your planning process, determining later on what those exact improvements would be, while others have zeroed in very specifically on the types of improvements that they want. Doing so, of course, requires you to just fund those improvements, but it does provide some predictability for others too. Also, there's got to be a deadline as to when construction of public improvements will begin according to statute, and the statute requires that you initiate those improvements within 5 years after you adopt your tax increment area, unless you can show cause as to why there should be a delay. So you have a little bit of flexibility as to when you adopt a tax increment area, as to when you actually start building that area or issuing the debt, so you can closely tie development readiness to your issuance of debt. And the local government only receives the TIF revenues for the period of time that's necessary to pay for those public improvements. So if you fully fund your public improvements with the TIF revenue within 20 years, after that 20-year period, then that tax increment area ceases to exist. And in maximum, you can't have a tax increment area longer than 25 years. These are, everything on the left are sort of the basic infrastructure improvements that TIF allows to utilize TIF resources for, and they're the general horizontal stuff that you can think of: the water, the streets, the sewer. It also includes parking facilities, dock facilities, park and ride facilities, parks, parking community facilities and recreational areas, And then the right-hand column has some affordable housing and historic preservation activities that could be financed with TIF resources also. So there is a project analysis component in the state that you have to produce a project analysis, submit that to the state for their review before the city council or port or county considers a tax increment area ordinance. And that needs to include the description of the expected private development within the TI, both with and without the public improvements. And so that's really the but-for requirement. Looking at what the assessed valuation is likely to be without the public improvements, and then looking at the assessed valuation would be with the public improvements. So it's not a significantly high bar that the state statute has required, but nonetheless, it's good public policy so that you can assure your citizens that you're representing that you're not simply providing a gift for the development world, and that this is truly something that's necessary to make a development viable. So there's also an assessment that has to occur, and the legislative session this last year added some additional requirements, but you have to look at the impacts to affordable and low-income housing, if there are any, the local business community, local school district, and local fire service. And then the legislature added this last session that there's also an assessment that needs to be made for public hospital districts and emergency medical services. And really, and then the last caveat was that any impacts to any junior taxing districts have to be sort of evaluated as part of the project analysis. If 20% of an assessed value in a public hospital district, and that's the new language in bold, or fire districts impact, or the fire district's annual report is impacted as identified in the adopted capital facilities plan, if those demonstrate an increase in the level of service directly related to the increment area, then a mitigation plan must be negotiated with those entities. And if the parties can't agree on what that mitigation would be, there is an arbitration process. 3 arbitrators are selected, one by the TIF sponsor, one appointed by the junior taxing districts, and the other appointed by those 2 arbitrators. We haven't seen any project analysis reach this 20% threshold. Generally, the percentage of what a tax increment area is impacting fire district, as the case in all previous TIAs, was closer to probably 2 to 3%. So never even coming close to the 20% threshold. That may change a little bit with public hospital districts, but nonetheless, I don't know that we're going to find that 20% threshold ever being crossed. It's more likely than not that you'll simply have junior taxing districts stand in opposition to the tax increment area or want to negotiate outside in more of a voluntary manner rather than a mandated manner by the statute. Must also include either, again, as I mentioned, a general or specific description of the public improvements along with the cost estimates. An important point is that public improvements don't need to be located inside a tax increment area, but there must be a nexus to that private development. Must also include a job analysis and a risk assessment and mitigation plan. And of course, that all leads eventually to the passage of a tax increment area ordinance, and none of that requires that the TIF sponsor fund any of the proposed public improvements. That will come later on. TIF doesn't require that you issue any debt, rather also you could simply pay for public improvements on a pay-as-you-go type scenario. Gets a little more complicated because generally you need enough cash to really sort of incentivize development, and a pay-as-you-go scenario doesn't always accomplish that. So a few noticing provisions, and some of these are new. The ones that are bold from the last legislative session. One is that you provide notice to all local governments within the increment area that of your intention to form a tax increment area 90 days before submitting that project analysis to the Office of State Treasurer. And so if you sort of look at all the time frames associated with TIF, that really sort of backs you into needing to provide that notice by November of this year in order to successfully complete the process in order to adopt the tax increment area by the next cycle, which would be June 1 of 2025. You then submit that project analysis to the state. The state has 90 days to review it. So right off the bat, we're 6 months in terms of a noticing provision. Most of the work can be done within that 6-month period, however. Then at the same time, you submit that project analysis to all the local governments that when you submit it to the state, and that has to be done 90 days prior to the anticipated ordinance adoption. You need to hold 2 public briefings that are exclusively focused on the tax increment area that can't be combined with any other subject matter that your council or other board or government is considering. And that has to be done no earlier than 90 days after submitting the project analysis to the Office of State Treasurer. You need to publish in a local newspaper, and then you provide notice, of course, to all the affected taxing districts. And then the increment area is effective June 1 in any 1 year. And if you miss any of those noticing provisions, or you're not ready to adopt by potentially May of 2025, you'll need to wait for the subsequent year in order to form a tax increment area, as the legislation only allows a tax increment area to be formed June 1 in any 1 year to allow the assessors time enough to prepare for calculating how they're going to allocate the revenues from TIF. This is the basic timeline that we see for 2024, 2025. We break all our analysis up into 2 parts. The first part being more of a strategy, determining whether or not the tax increment area even makes sense, and is it a viable thing to do for the jurisdiction. And if so, then we proceed into more of the work of the project analysis and submit to the state, and that's step 2. And so we'd have to have, again, kind of the noticing the taxing districts occur by November. That starts the 90-day clock. We would do the step 2, which is the project analysis, submit that to the state for its 90 days, conduct some early outreach because it's still new legislation, and many taxing districts are not familiar with it. Do the 2 public briefings, and then in April, May timeframe is when you'd see the ordinance or resolutions being adopted, and then implementation anything after June. So there's some observations real quickly. Again, TIF works best when private projects are ready to go, if not for the public improvement needs. So it's really a project looking for financing rather than financing looking for a project. If it's the latter, generally the projects typically sort of fall down and they're not really ready yet. They're not right for the TIF legislation. Early outreach to other taxing districts is very important because, again, the legislation is new, and there are some junior taxing districts of the belief that they will be harmed as a result of allocating tax revenues that they normally would collect if development were to occur, and then that's going to the TIF sponsor. And so there's a lot of education that's necessary with junior taxing districts, and we believe that the legislation has some really no harm provisions built into it, which allows the taxing districts to basically remain whole without suffering a loss of revenue from TIF. On average, we've seen TIF revenues generate about 5% of the total increased value over a 25-year period. So, for example, for every $100 million of assessed value increase, will support about $5 million of public improvement debt. That's based on 5% interest being applied as a cost of capital. Some projects are more, some are less. All the revenue that TIF generates is going to be based on the scope and magnitude of the private development, plus the levy rate of the jurisdictions that are inside the TIA, and then the speed in which that development occurs. But again, on average, we've seen about 5%. More education is needed regarding impacts of their taxing districts, as I was mentioning. And then subject to the scope and timing of development, TIF revenues may be sufficient to pay for some, or they may only be able to pay for an identified portion of those infrastructure costs. A city, county, port will be responsible for the debt regardless of development materializes. And some of the ways that we have proposed to mitigate those things are development agreements that identify both the public and then the private development responsibilities and timing. Helps to mitigate any surprises and any revenue surges to cover the annual payments. But more specifically, any kind of financial agreement in which the developers will financially backstop some to all of the annual debt not covered by the TIF revenues. We've seen that in a couple of jurisdictions. I've helped a couple of jurisdictions negotiate those agreements so they can be assured themselves that the developer will be there to backfill, again, some to all of the debt not covered annually by any TIF revenues. with the provision that that developer is also paid back in later years if those TIF revenues exceed the debt service that the jurisdiction has. And that's it for sort of a general tax increment area overview. And so hopefully I addressed some of the questions, but if not, be glad to delve in deeper into some of these areas.
Questions for Bob? Go
I
ahead.
was
Heather.
thinking, well, that was a mouthful. That's learning a lot. Now, has the city of Port Orchard used TIF? And if so, what projects have we used that on?
We've never used TIF.
Nope. Yep. That's why we're learning about it.
So Bob, I've got a question. A study, what was a typical study cost and how long do they take to complete?
So we break our studies up into two parts. The first part is depending upon how much work we need to do in sort of developing the development program, the pro forma. But if that's for the most part known, which is one of the reasons why you'd want to use TIF if the development pro forma is ready to go absent the infrastructure. The first part will be about 24,000. And then the next part will be 45 to 50,000. So about 75,000 is what we've been experiencing with cost estimates and cost for preparation of, that's from everything point A to point Z, from step one all the way through ordinance adoption or resolution adoption if it's a port.
And the timeline?
30 to 45 days, depending upon, again, how fully baked the development program is and ready to go for step one. And then 45 to 60 days on step two. So those components fit within kind of the 6-month time frame that the state has established for the, sort of the noticing provisions.
Thank you.
Commissioner Chang, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. One is that, is this sort of like an additional property tax assessment?
Is there additional property tax assessment?
I'm just trying to understand, like, who is paying the increased taxes? Is it property owners?
It's the same levies are being applied within the tax increment area as outside the tax increment area. So it's no change in the levy amount. Who's paying for that are those owners, those taxpayers inside the tax increment area. But it's also because there's these no harm provisions, we allow that individual taxing districts to grow their levy because they get what's called the new construction. That new incremental growth also applies to their total levy growth. So basically all of that is being, the full amount is being sort of spread out over the larger district area. So there is an amount that people are paying that's more, but it's spread out over the entire district.
And is there an example other than the Costco in Richfield that could explain sort of like how this works? Like, you know, what was the project, what was paid for, or I guess this is a new program, so we don't have many examples.
We don't have many examples. There's been very few projects to date that have started the infrastructure investments. The city of Pasco just recently issued $39 million in debt for its infrastructure investment based on the tax increment area that it formed. But that project is still in its early stages, and so it really hasn't generated the revenue yet to show where those revenue sources are coming from and what the increases have been to the various areas. So they're all just in the very early stages of development.
And for all of the Economic Development Committee members, we can send out a link to the MRSC site that includes the Pasco, Kirkland, and Wenatchee examples that were all done between 2021 and 2023. And there's you can read the full reports that were prepared. What Bob references the $75,000 cost to do the study. Those studies are online, and you can read what these studies look like in the other jurisdictions where they were conducted.
Yeah, we've also done project analysis for Moses Lake, Chelan, Blaine, course, you mentioned the city of Pasco, city of Kirkland, we did those. City of College Place, those are all been done in the last 2 years. And the state's website also has all of their review documents. They don't include the actual project analysis that was submitted, but they have all of their review documents based on probably the 12 or 14 different project analysis that they've reviewed across the state.
Any other questions for Bob?
I guess, Bob, I have one more question, and that is there an intermediate step before getting to the performa where we would want to just evaluate, because you're only allowed a maximum of 2 districts in your city? Would it be worth evaluating the alternatives for forming a district versus jumping right in with a specific district? And, you know, if I sort of have preliminarily shared with the mayor that I think there's 3, maybe 4 areas in the city where this potentially could be used, and would it be worth doing a compare and contrast of the alternatives prior to jumping in?
Yeah, I think it is. In fact, what we do when we do sort of our step 1 analysis is just that we look at several different TIAs that might be viable, and so that you could choose the best candidate TIA. In some cases, again, because you're limited to 200 million, you may not want to have a TIA that encompasses all of that 200 million at the start, thereby preventing you from forming a second TIA. And so you might want to hold something in reserve in terms of it's whether or not you contract that TIA or enlarge that TIA. Generally, we'll suggest that TIA should be formed around a development area where you expect development to happen within the next 15, 20 years. If you don't expect development to happen until the later half of that TIA, you're really sort of wasting all the development years in which you can continue to collect revenues because you're waiting on development to happen. So you want development to happen sooner rather than later to sort of maximize the financial advantage that you can gain from forming a TIA.
Gary?
If the studies that you work on to determine whether it's a viable thing in your area produces a viable area, are those costs recoverable once it's granted?
Yes.
Okay.
So in other words, if you're asking, is the study itself, can that be an expense that's paid back by TIA revenues? And the answer is yes. In some cases, we've also had developers share in those expenses. The contract is still with the jurisdiction that forms the TIA, but in some cases, the development community has stepped forward and has paid for a portion or half of whatever that study expense would be.
Another question, do you know, and because Gary's here and is also a port commissioner, do ports and cities ever partner on a TIF district, or does it need to be one or the other in terms of just managing the risk and sort of dividing the risk?
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet, although I've had discussions with a port and a city recently about, and this is more of along the lines of neither had sufficient debt capacity in order to fully complete the public improvements that were necessary. And so the discussion was, can we carve up the TIA, basically half going to the port, half going to a city, with each forming a tax increment area, and therefore each contributing towards a project. So that's one example. Somewhat complicated because it also then requires both political bodies to adopt the TIA, and if one doesn't, you're really left within sort of half the development area. But you certainly could have interlocal agreements with other jurisdictions, whether that be the county, the port, or another political entity, around how maybe even revenues would be either contributed towards the project or shared amongst the participants.
Would that be defined in the sponsor agreement?
Likely, it would be defined in some form of an interlocal agreement between the entities. It wouldn't be defined necessarily in the tax. The only thing that requires the political body to adopt the tax increment area is an ordinance if you're a city or county, or a resolution of your report. And so you may maybe reference that sort of future agreement as part of the recitals, but it wouldn't be in that body of that ordinance or resolution that adopts the tax increment area.
Okay, thanks. Good question.
James, you have a question?
Yeah, Nick said something earlier that that struck me. You said there's only 2 TIF districts allowed per city. Now, I'm thinking about this in terms of the three entities that can issue them, and how they've kind of got like concentric circles around, where they reside. So if there's a port district or a county, like a county, does that mean that if we've got a city in Kitsap doing a TIF, that there's only 2 per county, or 2 per port, or 2 per city? Or is it by the issuing body there's only 2, or if there are 2 in general?
2 by the issuing body. So in theory, you could have 6 tax increment areas within a jurisdiction, within a boundary of all the jurisdictions.
Awesome. Well, that answers my question.
So Bob, I got a follow up on that. So let's say we issued one in our downtown. You've been to our downtown a number of years ago, and then but the port assets are within that area. So could their TIF overlay on top of ours?
No, can't have any overlapping tax increment area boundary. So they could have one that abuts your boundary, adjacent, but they couldn't overlap your boundary.
And, and would that expand then also and create essentially a $400 million cap on that valuation if there are 2 of them together?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, you could have it, say you had all these adjacent TIFs, you could have, since you have 2, you could have $600 million worth of assessed value as the maximum within that area potentially.
I think people's heads, they're turning on how to get a parking garage.
Yeah,
exactly. That was going to
and I don't know how property tax works. So, I know the port has some properties that they're getting ready to clean up. I don't know if they have development plans for their own property, but I know for their land, they're not paying taxes. But if the port builds a structure or even develops one of their properties, there is no tax owed on that building, correct?
New legislation you're correct. They don't have generally cities, counties, ports, if they own their own land. They're not taxed, but with the tax increment area changes, I think 2 legislative sessions ago, what gets built and affixed to that property as personal property will be evaluated and used for purposes of calculating TIF revenue. So private development can come forward and build something on a land lease that's owned by the port. And that facility would be taxable under TIF and generate its own TIF revenues. The land would not. That would be part of the base, which is 0, but that would be excluded from the calculation. So I mean, generally TIF works. You get sort of the full use of the 200 million really only comes into play generally when you're doing infill development, because most vacant land has very little value in terms of that 200 million. So but within development you can also have more of it doesn't require some sort of contiguous boundary for TIF. We've seen some pretty odd looking TIF boundaries, and even more like a Swiss cheese approach where you're removing areas that have been recently developed because likely they're not to redevelop, and all that's doing is just taking away from that $200 million that you have as a capacity. So you could have again a Swiss cheese looking kind of boundary that forms around your development.
Any other questions for Bob?
Bob, if I could ask a question, this has been utilized very lightly. What have you seen that you've loved?
The projects that would never have gotten off the starting block without TIF. Those are that's the real purpose of TIF, is being able to generate a project that never had a chance. Pasco's, I think, is a good example. It had such significant infrastructure expenses because it was 500 acres, vacant land, no utilities, no infrastructure whatsoever. And TIF is supporting about 40 million of a need of close to $100 million of infrastructure. So that means the private developers putting in quite a bit, but it's not for the city moving that forward. That project would not have taken place. And there's other similar examples too that we're going to see that play out.
Thank you. Nick, if you offered to send the examples out, I think that'd be really helpful. Please.
Yeah, I'll send a link to Sean and have him send it to the distribution list.
It'd be nice if we could also get Bob's contact information also. We appreciate it.
Sure. I'll send you the, or send someone the slide deck that I used today to the extent that you use that as a reference.
Great.
Yeah, if you can get that to me, Bob, I can then distribute Nick's examples, your slide deck, as well as your contact information to everybody that's present here today.
Perfect. Any last questions for Bob?
Bob, I'd just like to extend my thanks. I think this is the second time you've done this. We had Bob do this in 2021 when this was a very new law. And this has come along, and it's still in the later stage of early, I'd like to think. But thank you, Bob.
Very welcome.
Appreciate your help.
Yeah, glad to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and the last item on our agenda today is the Kitsap Regional Library anchor discussion. I think Councilmember Fenton wants to lead that.
Yeah, sure. Now, I got some information on it that, well, it is on the city property, and it was given to the library down there from Public Works. And I don't know all the history, still kind of figuring that one out, but I mean, I still walk by it and I kind of forget it's there. And I feel like, oh, I discovered it like what, a month and a half ago, but it's always been there. Now it is cleaned up a little bit, some of the weeds and all that. But my objective that I would love to see through is that we move that anchor and we put it by the kind of diagonal across from the totem pole, but it's right kind of in front or to the side of the Welcome to Port Orchard down there. I think because we've been talking about, even with POPSA, not so much name, having a new name for us, but we want just to bring in like a nautical theme. And I think having that anchor more visible where everybody can see it, you can take pictures by it. And I just think that would just be a wonderful addition. It's already down there, but just in a different position for people to notice. And then also I noticed up by the yacht club, right out in front to the left, they have a huge anchor out there. And I just think, I don't even, you guys probably maybe even seen it down there, but that's a great big anchor too. And who knows, maybe they'll let us move it into the city where it's more visible. But I just think that would be a great, for the people, tourism. So that's my thoughts on it.
I have a photo. How do I share it? I also emailed it to Nick. I don't see show on my Zoom. Do I not have the option? Oh,
here I can pull it up if you'd like. I've got it on Google Street View.
I'm sure you're much faster, Nick, than I would be.
So here's the anchor.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so it would be great. Shoot, I should have had another picture down there. Before they had cleaned that up and got some of the weeds underneath it, but it was overgrown. You don't even notice it. Oh, perfect. You kind of did that. Right on.
So this is where you're talking about wanting to put it. I
yes.
think
over to see the people. Do you see the people right there? Yeah. So now there's a new sign, obviously, down there. You see that big grassy area? Mm-hmm. Right behind the people and between the fence, the sign, kind of right in there. Yeah.
That's not an area that we currently maintain, the Port of Bremerton does.
I thought that was the city's right there.
DNR leads.
Okay, but okay. I also talked to them about it, and I'm sure they would be more than willing to put an anchor right there.
I think the main risk is you want to have it spaced far enough from the pathway that you don't want somebody to get injured on it if they're riding their bike on the pathway. But there is some room between the trees. There's picnic tables between the first two trees and the third and fourth tree, but there's an area a little bit further back where you could do it, maybe where it's far enough from the pathway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open. I just think it'd be just a nice addition to bring it more to light for people down there.
You should probably bring that, if you want to put it on the port stuff, bring it to a port meeting and let the commissioners weigh in on that, and maybe talk to Jim Rothland, the CEO out there, and just to start the conversation.
Okay, sure, that'd be great.
There's probably also a couple other things down there if you're starting to look at things that could be improved around the library. There's the sign that it says "Welcome to the City of Port Orchard, home of the county offices" or something. That sign needs some refurbishing. It's looking kind of rough. And there's some stuff on the port property too. We're going to spend some money down there and do some work on some of our other assets, but it should all get looked at.
Heidi, you're going to run with that at the port?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Let us know what they say, and we look forward to a future recap on what they tell you.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Heidi. Let's see, we got a few minutes left. Do we have any good of the order?
I've got
Yeah, Gary?
Well, it was on the top of my list today, and this TIF presentation folds right into it. I just want to suggest that the city, the port, stakeholders need to have a serious discussion about solving parking in Port Orchard. And the article in the newspaper today just sort of illuminates that about Paulsbo and the struggles they're having up there. So rather than wait until the problem is upon us in full force, we should start thinking about how we're going to solve this problem in Port Orchard, which is coming our way. And if it's a parking garage, maybe a TIF idea is a good way to fund that, because they're just darned expensive to begin with. And nobody wants to pay for it all themselves, but we need something like that.
Gary, if I can, yeah, I completely agree with you. And our downtown master plan actually calls for it, on between Frederick and Geiger. But the key driver to that is the residential development that sits on top of it. And we had a developer at one point for that project. I'm hopeful that as we rebuild Bay Street and Kitsap Bank's project comes out of the ground, that we're going to see someone interested in that residential development, and maybe the cost of capital is going to make things more affordable too. So I completely agree with you, and logical partners are the developer, the port, the city, and Kitsap Transit has an interest too. So, well, it's not anything in the short term. I think we're a few years out here until we, a year or more till the bank breaks ground, and a couple of years after that for the community center. But as those things become reality, it's going to be easier to sell housing in a massive housing project that sits on top of a parking garage as those projects come to fruition.
Sure. Okay. That's all I got.
Thanks, Gary. Anybody else for good of the order?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about our next meeting. Jim and I both are going to be at a conference on, I think our next meeting is scheduled on the 9th, and I don't know of any pressing items for the agenda. I wanted to see if the committee was open to skipping September and going to October, or if you'd like to hold the meeting, we'll have to send out the packet extra early, and currently we would need topics.
So I'll weigh in as it'd be a nice, easy. I wouldn't mind if we meet in October. I'm also the LTAC chair, and we'll be doing much of the LTAC work in that time frame. So those of you who are interested in LTAC information know that is forthcoming in the next couple of weeks. So I would vote to meet in October?
I
Heidi?
think it's a good idea, and I really like Gary's idea about the parking group, and I would actually urge the port to organize a discussion, before 3 years are gone, to see what we can do in the meantime, what sort of mitigation or just organization or just coordination there could be. I know that the many merchants are really terrified about what could happen in the next few years as construction threatens to begin, and how that would affect their livelihood on Bay Street. So I think just them knowing that we're having discussions about it now could be very reassuring.
Okay. I'll agree to weigh in or work on that for us.
So I think that's 2 for meeting in October. Heidi?
Yeah, that's fine. And I'll be working on my project.
Perfect. Okay, so that answers your question, Nick. Let's move forward with October.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else for good of the order?
The cruise was great.
It was.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of people. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
amazing.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you to all our partners for being here. Thank you for bringing on Bob, Joe. I appreciate it. And we will see you all in October.
Great.
We will call
Thank you.
this meeting adjourned.
Thank you.